stress in the body. Now, I know this is a really timely lecture. I know that you guys are all stressed out, and I always say that my students are probably better poised to write a book about stress than anybody else. It's a lot to go through, either an accelerated nursing program or have full working lives and go back to school. And it's a very stressful thing to go through. So we're going to talk about stress today from the perspective of, obviously this is a pathophysiology class, so we're going to talk about it from the perspective of understanding the stress response, and then understanding what some forms of stress how some forms of stress can affect health and affect the proper functioning of our bodies, and can potentially lead to diseases, or at least certainly worsen the prognosis for some pre-existing diseases. So sort of our interest here is really understanding stress, understanding how we process stress, what a stress response looks like, what an adaptive stress response looks like, what a maladaptive stress response looks like, and then how that affects our bodies. So we can define stress in many ways, and we tend to think about stress as being a universally bad thing. But in fact, stress is normal. Okay? Stress is very beneficial. So in order for any organism to survive, including us, including humans, we have to actually adapt to our environments. And we have to adapt not just behaviorally, we have to adapt biologically to our environment. And part of that interplay is that we are faced with a variety of stressors in our environment that our body then adapts to. Okay? And in that adaptation, that what was once a stressor is no longer a stressor. Okay? And the adaptation to that stress actually puts us in a position where we are better at handling all other forms of stress. Okay? So encountering stress on a regular basis is a normal part of functioning in the world, and it actually benefits us in terms of our health. So where stress becomes a problem is when stress becomes overwhelming, acute and overwhelming in nature, or persistent and unrelenting. Okay? That's where stress becomes sort of detrimental rather than healthy. So, but in terms of healthy stressors, two of the most important healthy stressors that we have are demanding mental activities and demanding physical activities. Okay? So demanding mental activities is basically learning. Okay? And not just learning, comfortable learning. Okay? The best learning is uncomfortable learning. The best learning, the one that actually benefits our brains the most, our bodies the most, are the ones where we're uncomfortable when we're trying to do this new thing. Okay? We actually get a stress response. You get a little mini stress response, and nobody wants to experience that, right? But we get to a point where we've learned the activity and our brain is healthier for it. Okay? So these challenging mental activities, and then challenging physical activities, right? You can't really, any random week, you can't open the New York Times health section without finding some sort of benefit to exercise, right? It's really freaking annoying to me, but especially when you haven't gotten to the gym in a long time. But yeah, exercise, improve your marriage. Exercise makes you smarter. Exercise, right? Because physical activity, and it's really, really clear that physical activity, when you stress your body in these sort of healthy doses, followed by a healthy resting period, your body adapts physically and allows you actually a greater tolerance for more physical stressors. Okay? You can actually handle more stress physically because your body has adapted to the stress you've introduced it to. Okay? And we've all experienced that at some point or another. So this sort of healthy range of stressors, they make us smarter, they make us healthier, they make us stronger, and they make us better capable of coping with all other forms of stress. Okay? But like I said, the key to healthy stressors is that they are not overwhelming, right? They are not too overwhelming in the short time scale, and also that there is an appropriate respite in between the stressors. It's not unrelenting. There is actually rest. Okay? So we can define stress in many ways, but some definitions include that stress is biologically speaking here, stress is a state of tension that can either lead to a disruption of homeostasis or just threatens to disrupt homeostasis. Okay? Some sort of tension that disrupts or threatens to disrupt homeostasis. So physical stressors, biological stressors include things like cold stress. It can include stress in the form of hypoxic stress, where you're exposed to a higher altitude and there's less oxygen in the environment. A whole host of physical stressors. Okay, and even those stresses are actually within a normal range, are actually beneficial. Okay, so some of these elite athletes that are like training for the Olympics or training for some of these elite competitions, there's like oxygen chambers that mimic altitude, right? So there's a lower oxygen tension in these chambers, and it allows them to, they carry out their workout, or they just experience that for a period of time, and that stress, when they then take them out of that stress, their bodies adapt to it. And one of the adaptations that especially these athletes are working for is that their body will start increasing the red blood cell count, right? It's kind of a way it's a doping mechanism, basically, right? So if you sleep in one of these oxygen chambers every night, your body for 8 hours or so is exposed to a lower oxygen levels, and all of a sudden you start producing more red blood cells. So that athlete, when they go to race day, they have a greater oxygen carrying ability in their blood, which means that their muscles can get more oxygen and they can potentially perform more. Okay, so periods of stress and then the adaptation to that stress is what makes you stronger, faster, better, whatever. Okay. The psychological phenomenon of stress, the psychological phenomenon of stress is very similar in nature to things like nervousness, fatigue, anxiety. Okay? That's what stress feels like. That's how stress sort of manifests. But in general, especially in terms of the psychological aspect of stress, stress is really defined as a feeling of self-doubt about being able to cope with some situation over time. Okay? So stress really is this feeling of doubt, self-doubt, about being able to cope with some situation over time. Okay? So that's an interesting definition because it means inherently that stress is a very individual experience, right? I judge whether I can cope with this situation over time, right? And someone else's judgment of whether I can cope over time is meaningless. If I decide I can't cope over time, then I'm going to feel stress. So it means that stress is a highly personal experience. Okay? So the circumstances, a set of circumstances can create debilitating stress in one person, but can potentially be not that stressful for another person. And maybe that other person, they don't find it that stressful because they've been through that experience before. Or they have a lot of confidence that they've got a lot of support, right? They got a great spouse, they got family, they have friends. Okay? There's a lot of things that are going to go into this feeling of self-doubt and being able to cope with some situation over time. Okay? So stress is extremely individual, it's extremely personal. Excuse me. Now, we're going to talk about sort of the physiological basis for stress. Right? What's going on in our bodies when we're feeling stress. And what goes on in our bodies, whether we're feeling psychological stress or we're experiencing biological stress, okay? What goes on in our bodies is the same. And that's a fairly unique human characteristic. Okay? Actually, that's not true. It's not uniquely human, but there are very few species that actually psychological stress, okay, that situations that trigger sort of psychological discomfort can actually trigger the same stress response that real mortal threats to your body can trigger. Okay? And in the documentary, there's some great examples of how this plays out in humans and how it plays out in just a few animal species that, you know, we share a lot of DNA with. So the odd-looking man with a rat is named Hans Celias, and he was a Hungarian physiologist, biologist. He actually was of Hungarian descent, but he lived in Austria and Canada through his life. He was an endocrinologist, and he really is credited with discovering some of the first clues about the biological basis of our stress response, and also sort of describing the general pattern that the general pattern of responses our body takes on when we encounter stresses. So he did the bulk of his work between the 1950s and the 1970s. And I say that just because that personally impresses me, because you would think that something as fundamental as our body's stress response is something we would know, that's knowledge we would have had for a long, long time. But it's relatively new information. Okay? I mean, some of this information is only about less than 10 years older than I am. That impresses me personally. So this is relatively new mechanisms, new information. And what Hans Celias did, he was an endocrinologist, and he studied endocrinology, studied hormones at a time when many of the hormones we actually know very well today were not known. And the way that endocrinologists, we knew that there were these circulating chemicals in our body that influenced body function, but we hadn't isolated them yet. So what Hans Celias did was he was preparing these organ preps. So he would take pieces of pancreas and he would grind it up and he would inject it into rats. Or he would take pieces of the liver, grind it up and inject it into rats, right? Because his thought was these chemicals were being released by these various organs, so if I grind it up and put it into the animal, then I'm probably giving them at least some of that particular hormone. And what he found was, and he was doing this repeatedly over time, and what he found was no matter what organ prep he put into an animal, he found over time 3 common biological changes in every animal that he did this to. Okay? The first was he found that the adrenal cortex got huge. You get this enlargement of the adrenal cortex. Okay? Number 2, he found that some of the lymphatic organs, like the thymus and the spleen, shrank. What system are these lymphatic organs? What are we talking about? Immune system, right? So these are immune-related organs. They shrank. And he found that when he looked at the stomach and duodenums, when he looked at the GI tract, he found widespread bleeding ulcers. Okay? So he found these 3 biological changes consistently, no matter what organ prep he persistently injected into these animals. Okay? So he hypothesized that what he was actually doing was not specific to any organ, but what he was actually doing was causing them stress. Okay? And so he tried this with other forms of stress. He blasted loud music, right, chronically to these animals. He injected this, and he wasn't very nice. Or at least he didn't really care too much about rats, apparently. He injected toxic substances, irritating substances. Any form of chronic stressor he subjected these rats to, he found the same 3 biological changes. Okay? So based on his results, he started to craft this theory of what that he called as the general adaptation syndrome, which is basically how our bodies react to persistent stress, or how our bodies react to stress. Okay? Because those 3 biological changes he identified as being a consequence of persistent and toxic stress on the body. So his theory, this general adaptation syndrome, he described which was basically how our stress response behaves, okay? The nature of our stress response. He described it as having sort of 3 basic components. That when you are introduced to a stress, the first stage, or the first phase that someone goes through is something called the alarm response, where a stress response is mobilized as a result of exposure to a stress. And the next stage that he hypothesized was a stage that he called the stage of resistance. This is where, upon repeated exposure to the stressor, your body adapts. Okay? You become resistant to that stressor. And he hypothesized that the normal relationship, the non-pathological relationship that people had to stress, was that we're constantly moving between these first 2 phases. That we're constantly introducing new stressors into our life, having an alarm response, and then becoming resistant to that stress. And then that allows us to take on a new stressor, or an increased intensity of the same stress. And we go back to the alarm, and then eventually we move into resistance. Right? Think about, is anybody like a runner or a cyclist or anything like that in this room? I mean, I'm not talking about the last 6 months of your life. I'm talking about any other time in your life. Yeah. So when you want to, so if you're a runner and you want to get ready for a 10K or whatever, or if you're really intense, you're doing a marathon, okay? Number 1, do you start off training If you're really only running at like a mile or so at a clip, do you then just start running 10 miles? Do you just start doing? Say, I'm going to run 10 miles on Monday. I'm going to run 15 miles on Wednesday. By 2 weeks, I'm going to be into 26 miles. No, right? You don't do that. But if you've been running at a mile, you might start at 3 miles, right? Do that for a week. And then you bump up to maybe like 4 miles or 5, whatever. You're gonna gradually increase your mileage. Okay? But you're gonna give yourself enough time in between to adapt to the mileage that you've introduced. Right? And in terms of your perceived effort, when you first start training and you start running those, go from 1 mile to 3 miles, you're going to feel like hell, right? But then you do that for 2 weeks, and all of a sudden 3 miles feels just like 1 mile did. That's resistance. Now you jump up to either you run that 3 miles faster, or you do it uphill, or you go to 5 miles or something like that, but you increase the level of stress, and you're right back to feeling uncomfortable, right? But then eventually, after a while, you no longer feel uncomfortable. You become resistant to it. So that's the going back and forth between the alarm and resistance, okay? And that's the healthy relationship between with stress that we can have. The third stage is when stress becomes maladaptive, right, and potentially harmful. And this is what is called the stage of exhaustion. Okay? Because in the third stage, instead of being resistant to that stressor, the stress response comes back. And all of a sudden, the stress response creates a declining ability, a worsening. And so in terms of our running analogy, our example of running, somebody decides that they're going to, somebody employs no guidance whatsoever to train for this marathon. And they just decide they're going to run, I'm going to run 6 miles every single day. Just mind over matter. I'm just going to run 6 miles every single day, okay? And with no rest, with no resting days, okay? What they're going to do is their ability to run those 6 miles is going to get worse and worse and worse because there's no time for the rebuilding. There's no time for the adaptation. They've failed to adapt, and their body is into this exhaustion phase. So that exhaustion phase happens when people, the stress is too overwhelming, either perceived or actual, it's too overwhelming, or it's too persistent and there's no respite. That's when exhaustion kicks in, and that's when the stress response comes back in their bodies and it starts deteriorating their health. Okay? So that was Hans Celias' proposed phases of the general adaptation syndrome, the body's relationship to stress. And it's been, it still holds true today with some modifications in terms of the mechanisms. Okay? He was sort of describing the phenomenon of what was going on, but now we understand better the mechanisms. So what goes on both anatomically, physiologically, when we activate a stress response? Okay? Interestingly, all forms of stressors get processed the same way. Okay? All forms of stress get triggered the same way and trigger the body stress response the same way. Okay? So we first start, so we're going to sort of use some not so technical terms first, then we're going to replace them with sciencey words, I promise. 1 second. Okay, but we're going to start with some stressor. And this stressor can be real or it can be perceived. Okay? It can be a negative physiological stress like cold. Okay? It can be an emotional stressor or it can be a cognitive stressor. Okay? But so any kind of stressor, okay, actual or even just perceived. So let's go to something that's really basic. Let's say I see a snake. Okay? That's a stressor. That's a real stressor. Okay? So the first thing that happens is there's got to be a part of my brain that recognizes snake. Okay? And it happens to be an area in the frontal cortex of the brain that we're going to call right now our thinking brain. The thinking brain sees that snake and it thinks, oh, snake. Okay? That doesn't do anything for me. Okay? Just knowing that there's a snake there does not save my life from this snake. Okay? Because it doesn't motivate me to do anything. Oh, it's a snake. That message has to then go to a part of our brain that is our feeling and reacting brain. It's a part of our brain that may not have a great relationship with, but it's important. Okay? Because it's really our emotional brain. Because, oh, a snake doesn't help me. Oh my God, it's a snake. I gotta get the fuck out of here. That helps me. All right? That helps me. That motivates me to do something. Okay? And it's that emotional part of my brain that is then going to trigger the physiological stress response. It's going to, and there's two basic components of the physiological stress response, both of which we've already learned. The sympathetic nervous system and our adrenal cortex and its release of cortisol. Okay? But it's our feeling and reacting part of our brain that's going to trigger that. Excuse me. So, what are these parts of the brain that we're talking about here? Now, this part of the brain that looks something out of a Geiger painting, right? An alien movie. This part of our brain, it's outlined in pink. It's called the limbic system. In the center here is the thalamus. The thalamus is not really part of the limbic system per se, but it's an important landmark in terms of the where the limbic system is. But the limbic system is a collection of structures within the brain that collectively that work together. They're highly interconnected, and together we sort of call them our emotional brain. Okay? It is really our feeling and reacting part of our brain. Now, intimately connected to our emotional brain, but not quite part of the limbic system, is a part of the frontal lobe that we call the prefrontal cortex. Okay? It's so important in its connection to the limbic system, sometimes it's called the limbic cortex. Okay? But this prefrontal cortex is that thinking part of the brain. Okay? It makes important observations that are then sent to the limbic system to be evaluated for emotional content. Okay? So it's very important in things like making judgments, insight, gaining insight into something, motivation, mood, right? Emotional reactions. So that prefrontal cortex is it's the thinking portion. It's our sort of rational portion of some of our emotional reactions. Okay? And for someone to have, so we're going to talk about this in a second, but a lot of us have fairly predictable emotional reactions. based on past experience. And some of those emotional reactions can be very limiting for us, and we're always working, right? It's like an entire wing of Barnes & Noble is dedicated to trying to undo emotional reactions, right, that you have. But the key to that, right, actually the key to being able to gain insight into these reactions that you have and potentially change them is actually in that prefrontal cortex, right? Because it's sort of like the little objective, non-emotional person in your brain going, yeah, but that's not what this is, okay? So the prefrontal cortex is an important part of the thinking brain that connects to this emotional brain. Now, structures within the limbic system itself, the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a part of the brain that is important in a part of memory that we call declarative memory, which is really like very raw facts and figures, okay? Very tangible, basic, on the surface facts, and our ability to remember those things. Now, hippocampus is important in memory, but in short-term memory. Okay? When we want to remember something in a short-term way, the hippocampus creates that memory. When we learn something and it becomes part of our long-term memory, it's no longer stored in the hippocampus. It's stored elsewhere in the cerebral cortex. Okay? But in order to form any new memories, you have to form them within the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is not only important for short-term memory, but also learning, right? Being able to learn anything. Okay? And the hippocampus is important in terms of this whole idea of stress and the whole snake, because we want to remember these things that cause stress, especially if it was really life-threatening stressors. We're always learning and trying to remember the things that we encounter in the world that was stressful. Another part of the limbic system is the amygdala. And I promise you that the amygdala is a part of you that you probably like the least. Okay? Because the amygdala the amygdala is part of the brain that has, there's only two modes. Okay? There's silent and panic in the amygdala. That's it. Okay? Because the amygdala is critical for mobilizing a reaction to a stressor that you really see as just it's a mortal threat. Okay? It could be a conversation you have with somebody, okay? Or it could be literally a snake that you see, but your amygdala is going to light up. And you are going to react to it as if your life is threatened. And you're going to have sort of mortal fear to that. Okay? So it really is critical for coordinating responses to stress that have especially a very emotional content. And it integrates behaviors, creates behavioral reactions that are especially important in survival, perceived or real. Okay? It creates conditioned emotional responses. Okay? And just to drive home the point, if you happen to take an animal and be able to specifically stimulate the amygdala, what you see in that animal is a rage response. Okay? That's how they, that's what the behavior you will see if you just stimulate their amygdala. So the amygdala is like your friend and your worst enemy, because without it, it's really critical to your survival, but it also is critical to you being insane sometimes. Okay? The hypothalamus. Now, we've talked about the hypothalamus before. The hypothalamus we've talked about in basic physiology, we've talked about a little bit in patho. The hypothalamus is important it's actually part of the limbic system. It's important in a lot of baseline functions, right? It important for plasma osmolarity control. It's important for things like temperature control and appetite, sexual responses. The hypothalamus is very important for things like that. It's very base level functions in your body. And what the hypothalamus really is, it is really the connection between these thinking and feeling parts of your brain and the outputs to the stress response. Okay? So it's the hypothalamus that, when triggered by your thinking and feeling and reacting part of your brain, that can stimulate rapidly the sympathetic nervous system, and it can stimulate your adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Okay? So it's really the link between your brain's processing of stress and your body's output of stress. Interestingly, the olfactory bulb is also part of your limbic system. Olfaction means smell. So your sense of smell is part of this emotional part of your brain, right? And there are significant connections between the olfactory bulb and the hypothalamus and the hippocampus. So, and I've always found that very interesting, because it means that the certain smells that we experience in our life, we can actually connect them to we learn to connect them to a wide range of emotions. So we can have smells that are connected to really pleasant emotions and memories, and very negative ones, right? But in the context of that snake, okay, if that snake happens to live near eucalyptus because that's what it eats, okay, and I smell eucalyptus and I see that snake and I experience that connection more than a few times, I'm going to feel terrified every time I smell eucalyptus. Right? So just from a survival point of view, that being able to smell is really the same as being able to see and be aware of your environment and connect it to certain stressors. Okay. So all of these really critical brain regions in being able to respond to an acute stress, and also being able to learn create these sort of conditioned responses to previously learned stressors. Okay? So it doesn't take me very long to learn that, of seeing that snake, to learn that something that looks like that, right? Something that looks like a snake could be a snake, and therefore anything I see that I'm not sure what it is, but has that shape, okay, it's going to trigger that stress response in me, and I'm going to have that fear. Okay? Yes, ma'am. Right. So is it a given that something that triggers a stress response is automatically going to form a long-term memory? It's not necessarily true. Not every stressor that you come across is going to be burned on your brain forever. But things that are repeated certainly will. Or things that make a particular impression, for one reason or another, certainly will. It's one of the reasons why people who grow up, unfortunately, get abusive families. There's like a pattern of behavior from the parents or from the people that are the abusers that the victims sort of pick up on and they see repeatedly and they experience repeatedly, that will absolutely be burned on their brain, and they'll recognize that. And it's one of those things that creates really maladaptive emotional responses later in life that were very critical for survival early in life. Okay. So these two components of our stress response, like I said, we've already learned these before, right? The sympathetic nervous system, and then our adrenal cortex and its ability to produce cortisol. So, putting aside for a second, I just want to you to just take a look again at the sympathetic nervous system and put aside how annoying it was to learn it the first time around. But you want to look at how the arrangement of the sympathetic nervous system is just perfectly arranged for a global, rapid response to a stress. Okay? So you get a stress response that comes screaming down your spinal cord, and within seconds, you can mobilize your entire body. You get a full body response. Okay? You get an increase in heart rate. Okay? You get bronchodilation of the lungs, and you take in more oxygen, so you can deliver that. Not only are you pumping more blood, but you're oxygenating it better, and you can deliver that to your skeletal muscle. Your increased perfusion to skeletal muscles, you can either fight that stressor or flee it. Okay? Sympathetic innervation to the liver, among other things, increases glycogen breakdown and glucose, blood glucose levels. Okay? So within seconds, you can mobilize this full body response, okay? Including the medulla of the adrenal medulla, stimulating it to release epinephrine, right? And so this hormone gets into your body, and not only are you through the sympathetic nervous system, through the nerves, not only do you have a rapid response, now when you have epinephrine or adrenaline on board, now you have a long-lived response. Okay? So very quickly, you mobilize your entire body through the sympathetic nervous system. Right? And then the other part of the stress response is the hypothalamus and its ability to stimulate the anterior pituitary and release CRH, which causes the release of ACTH, and the adrenal cortex releases cortisol. Okay? And then cortisol levels rise in your body. And we've already studied some of all of the actions of cortisol, but just to drive home some of these, cortisol is a vasoconstrictor, so blood pressure goes up. It acts on the liver, also increases glycogen breakdown and gluconeogenesis, so blood glucose goes up. It causes your kidneys to hold on to more calcium, which is going to be needed for muscle contraction. You retain more sodium, which is going to be needed for muscle contraction. Okay? You get this increased excitability of the brain, right? Which is good because you need to be able to think on your toes. Okay? Mental acuity. And also, you get this suppression of immune function. What's supposed to be a temporary suppression of immune function in order to mobilize energy elsewhere. Okay? Because in the context of an acute stress response, it's okay to take a few minutes out from immune function. Okay? Because all of these stress responses are designed to be short-lived. Okay? And are meant to be followed by respite. So we have these biological components of our stress response. And what starts to happen when stressors become persistent is that you get this persistent activation of the sympathetic nervous system, of cortisol. And this, you fail to shift back into this resting mode where we are digesting things, where we are reacting to, where we have a strong immune reaction to things. Okay? We fail to really take care of our bodies, and then the exhaustion sets in. Okay? So Celias general adaptation syndrome You know, we start off with a normal level, and what we're really talking about here is the solid line in this graph is our ability to resist stress, okay? Our ability to cope with stress, physiologically cope with stress. And then the dashed line is our actual cortisol level, which is a measure of how activated our stress response is. So these three phases, alarm, resistance, and exhaustion, in that alarm phase, okay, you notice that in that alarm phase, our ability to resist stress is at a low point. Okay, so that first visit to the gym after months of not being at the gym, right? That first mile that you run after a long time of not running, okay? It's gonna be ugly. Okay? It's gonna feel bad and it's gonna look bad. That's really, right? And you're going to be quite alarmed. Your body is going to be in that alarm phase. So your cortisol levels are going to be high because your body's like, whoa, we're not watching TV anymore. What's going on? Okay? However, you keep doing that. Okay? You do that with some regularity. You go back to the gym 3-4 times a week. You're doing good. Okay? All of a sudden, what happens? In between visits to the gym, your body starts to rebuild. So that first mile that you run, your body's like, this muscle tissue isn't going to do. So it starts to break down your muscle tissue. That's what the soreness is about, right? But it's rebuilding the tissue stronger and more efficient. Okay? Your heart is starting to get stronger also for the same reasons. So you have this physical adaptation to the stress during those times of rest. So then, after a week or two of running that mile, all of a sudden, you don't have, when you run that mile, you don't have this release of cortisol. You don't have an activation of the stress response. It doesn't feel terrible. Okay? You don't have soreness after that run. And in fact, your ability to resist that stress has gone up. Your ability to resist all forms of stress has gone up. By adapting to one stressor, you actually increase your ability to cope with multiple stressors. Okay? So if you're really focused on getting to 26 miles, what do? You screw it all up by increasing the incline or by going 3 miles instead of 1 mile. So what happens then, it's going to look ugly and it's going to feel ugly. You go back to alarm because you've increased the intensity, you increased the stressor. Okay? But you allow your body enough rest so that you adapt to this even greater stressor. So you're moving back and forth between alarm and resistance. Okay? However, the person who trained in like the worst way possible, where they take no resting days, they jump right into an extremely high mileage, high intensity, that person is going to move into the exhaustion phase. Okay? They're not giving their body time to adapt, so they're failing to adapt. Okay? And notice what happens in the exhaustion phase. Your stress response comes back, and your ability to resist stress starts to plummet. So what you're going to see is some clear signs of overtraining. You're going to see someone with cortisol levels go up, and their ability to handle stress goes down. So you start to see some classic signs of overtraining. Classic signs of overtraining is all of a sudden, at lower intensities, your heart rate gets way high, right? So we're talking still about exercise. So all of a sudden, you just ran 1 mile and you feel really winded and your heart rate is really, really high. Okay? Your body is reacting to fairly low levels of stress as if you're giving it huge levels of stress. That's classic exhaustion. Okay? And it's here that Celias really pushed his animals so that when they were at that point, right, their stress responses were burned out, right? Their adrenal cortexes were enlarged, their lymphoid organs were shrunken. Okay, that's where Celias was pushing his animals to this point of total exhaustion of their bodies and their stress responses.